Okay, Jeff. We'll already be live now. Yep, we are. Okay, so hopefully this goes better.
Okay, so this is part 2. Hey, we're trying again. We had technical difficulties, so we're going to play this video on risk management and try again.
All right. Please, please, please. Oh, please. Oh, please, oh, please, oh, please. Okay. So I need to share my screen.
And there's something playing in the background. Or maybe that's the coffee shop. Is it loud?
Not that loud.
I hear voices.
Yeah, there are people back here.
Are there people clattering dishes and everything?
Yeah,
It
there
might be
are.
that. All right, it's live
Maybe.
noise I'm hearing.
Okay, maybe I should. Huh.
I
Yeah,
hear
it is
music
picking up
too.
some. Do some mic background noise. Okay, I turned that reduce background noise thing on. Okay, that feature was actually not on in Firefox. I could not turn it on. All right, sharing this. All right, so fingers crossed.
Hi.
Hey,
I'm Howard
Plasma, welcome
Marks,
back.
and this is how to think about risk.
Are you?
Yep. Oh, wait. I hear music, but I don't. Is it coming from the video?
Paused?
Try it again.
The title of this class is
Yeah,
How
I
to
hear
Think
it.
About
Yep.
Risk.
Oh, thank goodness.
That's an important title.
Alrighty.
Not what to think, how to think.
Can you
The
is there a
first
way to make
question
it
is, what
loud?
is risk? Risk, in my
Let's see.
Maybe on YouTube.
Yeah, you might be able to make it lighter on YouTube.
Okay. Usually when I'm playing a video, I put the volume at max and let other people
Mic
adjust it on their end.
volume. I'm not seeing anything that lets me make it louder. This one just toggles the. Could maybe see about increasing the volume on my end. Looks like Chrome is maximum volume.
opinion
Let
is,
me.
Hi, I'm Howard Marks, and
Did that make it louder when I turned up my volume?
Mm-mm.
No? But you can at least hear it, right?
I mean, I can turn up mine, but like if it's low to me, it's going to be low for your viewers too.
Yeah.
I would just go get it off of YouTube and turn the YouTube audio all the way up.
Okay. I don't know why I can't really play with the volume any.
Because that video player doesn't give you a volume bar. They're control
Oh, that's
freaks.
crazy. Okay, I guess so. I can try the YouTube channel then. Oh. All right, taking its time loading this. Close this, close this. Close this. Okay, wow, it does not want to load this. Let me try on a different tab. Okay, there it is. All right.
Are you sharing it?
All right, it should be. Oh wait, I had to turn that off. Okay. Share screen. There it is. Okay, share. All right. All right. And you see this all right?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna hit play then.
Hi, I'm Howard Marks.
Oh,
And you
much
hear
better.
that?
Yeah, much better. It's turned all the way.
All right, great.
How long is this one?
This one's like 3.5 minutes.
The title of this class is How to Think About Risk. That's an important title. Not what to think, how to think. The first question is, what is risk? Risk, in my opinion, is the ultimate test of an investor's skill. The return alone doesn't tell you how good a job the manager did. The key question
Tell me what risk
is,
either.
you see the return, you must ask, how much risk did the manager bear to get that return? Now let's look at this range of managers. What we posit is that the market is up 10% or down 10%. Now let's look at some individual managers. The first one is up 10 when the market's up 10 and down 10 when the market's down 10. Accomplishes nothing. You might as well have invested in an index fund that emulates the performance of the market. No skill, no value added. Now let's look at the second one. Up 20 when the market goes up 10, down 20 when the market goes down 10. No skill, no
Still
value added, just a lot of aggressiveness.
Mhm.
But what about this one? Up 5 when the market's up 10, down 5 when the market's down 10. Again, no selection ability, no discernment, no value added, just defensiveness. You don't need help in achieving that, and you sure shouldn't pay a lot for it. But what about the next one? He or she is up 15 when the market's up 10 and down 10 when the market's down 10. So in other words, market type losses on the downside, but superior gains on the upside. Value added, what I call asymmetry, does better in the good times than does poorly in the bad times. But what about this one? And I think this is the most interesting. I think maybe it characterizes me, maybe it characterizes Oaktree to some extent. Up 10 when the market's up 10, down 5 when the market's down 10. So market type gains in the good times, I personally think that performing with the market when it does well is good enough. And that's almost all the time. Nobody should have to beat the market when it does well. But if you can do that and at the same time be ready to decline less when the market has its down spells, I think that's accomplishing something very important.
Okay, so that's the end of it. Any thoughts so far, Jeff?
No, are there ones that do better than the market, but also less risk than like a sixth type?
So more upside and less downside.
Yeah,
So essentially the perfect situation.
because
I'm sure there are.
he stopped himself at 10% to match the market, but there are some that would go to 15 and still have that 5% at the bottom.
I'm sure there are. But they would be exceedingly rare, and I think he was mostly just showing like the different ways it could go, right? So you can perfectly follow the market. You can have an exaggerated return to the market. You can have, a muted version of the market, and then you can do better when it's good, or equal when it's good, but less when it's bad. And then
And is that what you
implies-
try to do? Is follow the market? Like if you're at the 10%, you're good.
So I do price my investments so that the return would be like that of the market. And I can talk on a later day about how I do that. There's a a formula that helps you do that with pretty much any investment. But yeah, the main thing though that I think is key is like, how do I manage my risk? Because you can price anything to get a market like return. How do you avoid it blowing up in your face?
That's
Right.
where it goes down at the bottom.
The
That's
formula
what
will
you're
not
trying to.
help you there. Right.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's the issue. So let's go ahead and move on to. I think it should autoplay the next one. Yep. Yep.
It doesn't.
Hi,
Yeah,
I'm
there it
Howard
goes.
Marks, and
Sometimes the
this is how to
playlists
think
don't
about
always
risk.
stay inside themselves.
See, he was writing the sixth one there. Did you see that?
Oh,
I'm just joking. He just
I
was
believe that
numbering
risk
something.
is not volatility. The academics developing investment theory, largely at the University of Chicago in the early 60s, just a couple of years before I got there, adopted volatility as their measure of risk. I believe they did so largely because volatility is readily quantifiable and nothing else is. I think that volatility can be an indicator of the presence of risk, a symptom, if you will, but it's not risk itself.
Do you know what he means when he says volatility?
you talked about that the first time you talked about stocks.
Okay, so like, let me just try and find a stock real quick. What's something that? Okay, here we go. All right,
Is
so
that how
this
up
is
and down it goes?
yeah. So let's just look over the past year. So this is New York Community Bank Corp. This is one of my largest holdings in my own
You might have to
portfolio.
share the other tab.
Oh, is it not showing?
It doesn't default.
Okay, gotcha.
You have
Here
to
I would
manually
say,
change them.
let's see. Let's do this. So share screen. There we go. Okay, share. All right. Do you see this now?
Yeah.
Okay, so this is the 1 year price history for New York Community Bank Corp. They are a regional bank in New York, and their stock symbol is NYCB. They're one of my largest portfolio holdings. As you can see, they go up and down a bit. They had a sharp drop here. Now let's go like the last 6 months, right? So if you just focus on where it's been since the drop, it's as low as this is about $8 here. It goes up, peaks at 1167 here. So it's having movements of like 10 to 15% regularly within the span of sometimes a month. A lot of folks would look at this and say this is a volatile stock. Let's look at just the S&P 500. All right, so let's look at them over the last 6 months. If you look at the movements, it's generally up. There's not quite as many moments of volatility. You have this whole stretch here where it doesn't change a whole lot, right? From 5,300 down to like about 5,200. That's not a large percentage of change. And this is not to scale with the other one, right? But if we look at like this is a less than 10% movement from like 10% or less from here to here. So it's not having nearly the movement, or you're not seeing nearly as many ups and downs. So some people would say the S&P 500 is less volatile and therefore less risky. And Howard Marks is saying he doesn't see that as an indicator of how risky the market as an index fund in which you could invest is versus an individual stock that has a lot of volatility. He doesn't think that's risk. He thinks it could be a symptom of it. What he's clarifying is that a lot of other people in the would be like the finance and investing, like academia, they are often talking about volatility as risk. So he's establishing from the start that this is not what he sees as risk. But volatility, if you don't already know that this is what they mean by it, the up and down, that's what they mean. So I'll continue the video.
Okay.
Oh, gotta go back to share screen. Stop screen. Present, share screen. And okay.
If risk is not volatility, then what is it? And in my opinion, and in the real world, risk is the probability of loss. I think this is what most people mean when they say risk. And I think that this is what people demand compensation for if they're going to bear it. Nobody sitting around at Oaktree
Mhm.
says, well, we shouldn't make that investment because it might be volatile. Or because it might be volatile, we should demand a higher return. No, they say that about the possibility of loss. We're not going to make that investment because the possibility of loss is too high. Or because of the possibility of loss, we're going to demand a risk premium in terms of the return. This is risk, the possibility of loss. Now, another important question is risk quantifiable in advance? And I believe it's not. Like most things occurring in the future, risk cannot be anything except a matter of opinion. I was writing my first memo about risk in 2006. I wrote about my belief that risk is not quantifiable in advance.
It's judgment.
And then I hit the
Mhm.
return key and went on to the next section and wrote something I had never thought about before. My belief that risk is unquantifiable even after the fact. And I think this is a fascinating topic. You buy something for $1, and a year later, you sell it for $2. Was it risky? And the interesting thing is that you can't tell from the outcome. A profitable investment may or may not have been risky. Was it a safe investment that, in the case of my example, was sure to double? Or was it a risky investment where you got lucky in terms of the outcome? And as I say, you can't tell from the outcome. The bottom line is, to me, it's impossible to quantify risk in advance or even in hindsight.
Okay, so he establishes it's not volatility, and not only is it not that, but it's not even quantifiable. And he thinks the attraction to volatility is because it is quantifiable. And the way they quantify it is they look at what the average volatility of the market is over a recent period of time, typically, and then they compare any other investment to that, and that however much more or less volatile something is called the beta score. And
But
so
he's
if
saying that that's not. Don't go by that.
yeah. So if an investment has a beta score of 1, that means it perfectly correlates with the volatility of the market. If it's -1, that means when the market goes up 10%, that investment would go down 10%. If the market goes down 10%, that investment would go up 10%. Right? It's quantifiable, so people who are mathematicians like it for that reason, but he doesn't think this actually tells you about the risk of
Yeah,
an
because
investment.
it's more judgment. It's not.
Exactly.
It's not a mathematical process.
Exactly. All right,
But
let's move along.
this guy's saying science can predict risk. Well, maybe, but that doesn't mean they can quantify it.
Yeah, it's difficult to quantify. So you got to it's about identifying things that could go wrong. But it's not like I have X amount of reward and X amount of risk so much, right? It's
Yeah.
What can I lose, and what are the things that can trigger it? And that's a qualitative judgment.
This is like
Yes.
Schoolhouse Rock for grown-ups.
Hi, I'm
Mhm.
Howard Marks, and this is how to think about risk.
See, number 6, right there.
666.
The possibility of loss is not the only form of risk. There are lots of forms of risk. My last memo on the general subject, it's called Risk Revisited Again. And I talk in there about 24 or 25 different forms of risk, some serious, some facetious, some important, some less important and obscure, but still it comes in many forms. The risk of missing opportunities is another important risk. In other words, if you think about it, the risk of not taking enough risk. Another really important form of risk, I think one of the key risks in investing is the chance of being forced out at the bottom. Which is a bigger mistake? Buying at the high and seeing a decline, or selling out at the low and missing out on the recovery? Clearly, it's the latter. If you buy at a high and you experience a decline, if you're able to hold throughout and not lose your nerve, the next high is usually higher than the last high. The fact that you experienced a downward fluctuation might have been uncomfortable for a little while, but by the time the new high is achieved, you're back to your cost and more. But if you sell at the bottom and miss out on the subsequent recovery, that means you've gotten off the track of investing and may never get back on. In my opinion, selling at the bottom, it's the cardinal sin in investing.
Okay, that one is done. So this one I think is very useful. I wanted to go ahead and connect it to your situation a bit.
With the trolls.
Yeah, yeah, actually, I'm just looking at the comments. real
Selling
quick.
at the bottom. That's definitely what I'm doing.
I wanted to.
Or to the bottom.
Yeah, he's the capitalist, Marx. That's right. But yeah, chat. If you guys are like totally like struggling with anything he says, please let me know. Otherwise, if it's like a really big question, like a complex one, just save it for the end. But yeah, I don't want to like go through all this if you're already kind of stuck right now.
Right.
So yeah, let's go back to this one part though. Where is it? Okay, right here.
Comes in many forms. The risk of missing opportunities is another important risk. In other words, if you think about it, the risk of not taking enough risk. Another really important.
Okay, so what he described is something I think that you and everybody has heard before, which is opportunity cost, right? So, and this is why it's important to, this is why, like, for example, I disagreed with what Flow State said when he said risk management is only for loan officers and underwriters. Who else needs to be watching that, right? Given that he mentioned he has a background as a loan officer, I can see why his mind immediately shifts to that. But we all make decisions that have opportunity costs. Right now, by being in the stream, both you and I as the streamers, and then the other folks in the audience, what we are doing here now comes at the expense of anything else that we could have done with this time today, right?
I could
That
be
is the
watching
opportunity
Heather's.
cost. Right. And so we have to decide, was the risk reward in that decision worth it? Did we get the best out of it? And the risk there, of course, is difficult to quantify. Sometimes even the reward is difficult to quantify. When the money is the reward, then it's very easy to quantify. But in terms of like your personal satisfaction, it's hard to say.
Well, the money's just a means to that anyway.
Exactly.
That's the ultimate metrics.
Right. So you could make $1 million and then use it in things that completely scar you emotionally. In which case, making the $1 million investment was the riskiest thing you ever did, right? And yet, if you quantify it as $1 million, that doesn't really help you understand the nature of the risk. But let's talk about like your situation a bit, right? The risk of not taking enough risk. So, by having the stream at all, you risk the emergence of the drama, right?
Yes.
Some people will know that up front. Some people won't. And some people, even if they know it up front, may not appreciate how much drama there could be. But what's the alternative? Well, you're trying to have your own business. You're trying to be self-employed. If you sit on your hands, right, there's the risk of not taking enough risk, right? Which is it's sort of the risk of entropy, right?
Yeah.
If you don't do anything, eventually you start to fall apart. Everything around you starts to fall apart. So you are
Gen X.
You're on a slow crawl toward death, and if you do nothing, you can speed up that crawl. And that's the idea there. It's you'll get left behind. And so one way that you have managed that risk is you've developed the drama court system, which compensates you for whatever additional problems new episodes of the drama could create for you. It's at least paying for itself, right? But that's sort of it there. You make a business decision to start the stream. So that's a real part of it. It's the same as like private equity. When private equity is when you invest in a business, but it's not something on the market, right? You just give the money directly to the business, and then they say, okay, you own 10% or 20% of it.
That's before it goes public.
Yeah.
Okay.
But what you're doing right now with your stream, by putting your time, money, and self into it, It's private equity. You just have 100% of it because it's yours.
Oh yeah,
Maybe you could argue Google gets some of it because it's their platform. But
30%.
yeah. But whatever your cut of it is, that your cut is 100%
Google
yours,
slave.
right? And so it's fundamentally no different than the risk management you have to think when you're looking at a stock. You look at the stock, its financials, its risks, its potential opportunities in the future, and you think, how do I feel about this, right? You're going to make that decision, especially if you're thinking in the long term, which you should be, in the same way that you would for this, right? The difference is the stock doesn't require you to put some elbow grease into it. So that's the only difference, and I think that's actually a minor one. But yeah, I think your situation shows a good example there. You understand, you talk about it being like part of your sort of Gen X ethos, is that you need to get down and dirty if you want to be clean one day, right?
Mhm.
And so you understand the risk of not taking enough risk, but it's sort of like something you know in your gut, right? If you can think about it clearly and you know, oh, this applies to other things, and people who are familiar with your content can look at this and go, oh, right, but like this is why everything is risk management, because um, people think people can show that the capacity for risk management in situations that are familiar to them and relatable to them, and then they completely forget about it when they're in a different situation, right? They don't realize the
That's
parallel.
what I'm learning from this. That I have this skill set. I just don't know it in the context of investing.
Exactly. And so it's like there are some people who are great investors who will go way over the speed limit, right? And you might think they're so good at managing risk with a portfolio. Why don't they do that on the roads? Because there's a lot of potential for that to go wrong. Even if you're only measuring it in terms of time, right? If you've ever, actually looked at like how much time you could actually be saving with that increase in speed over your commute, it's probably only a few minutes extra. Um, if the police spot you and pull you over, well, they're almost certainly going to waste even more time
Right.
than you would have
I'm
spent
not a
on the
min
road.
maxer.
Yeah, and then also, you might have a court date, a big fine, potentially lose your license if it's a bad enough one. There's all these other things that come into it, right? And it's the same risk management. Like you can quantify some of it, but not all of it. And so this is why it's important to take that.
So
So,
it risk management is like knowing when not to take stupid risk, but also when to take smart risk.
exactly. It's like if you can manage the risk, right? Because it's not risk avoidance, it's
Right.
risk management. It's like you're wrestling a
Including when
bear.
to take when to risk.
Exactly. And so what's the bear you can best wrestle to get a better return than possible? He mentioned asymmetry before, right? You've heard me talk about asymmetry myself, right?
Mhm.
So that's what we're looking for. Is the reward for wrestling a bear that you're capable of wrestling worth it? If you have to know exactly what your limit is, basically. So yeah, let's
And
go
you
ahead and
learn
move it.
that through doing, like through
Yeah, they're
practicing
doing.
with.
And this when I say like
Hi.
Monopoly could be a good game for managing risk. Like it, it's kind of a joke, but it's also like it would actually work out that way. And I could probably run a game in a way with like 4 or 5 people who are not exactly investors or necessarily educated on any of this, but like just sort of run it through and explain to them and the audience like where's the risk part of this and how do they manage it in the context of monopoly. That could be an interesting thing to do going forward. um,
Yeah, and like stream it, do a live game.
yeah, I mean, why not? Like, why not make this entertaining for folks? Investing doesn't always have to be boring homework. you know
What about this thing that Ross is saying about Exxon risking civilizational collapse to profit?
well, if they know about it in the 60s, right, are they going to be around when civilization collapses? No. So as far as they're concerned, the risk is manageable to them because they'll just die before it happens. Whoever the investors or the managers are at the time, they're not worried about it. If we take that for a fact, I don't know the details, right? I would have to verify exactly what he means. I don't even necessarily know what he means when he says that. But like, if we just go with the scenario for the sake of the example, then yes, I mean, if they don't produce oil, then they can't make money, and then what do? Right? They're sitting on their hands, so that's why they did it. Not it's people can do some undesirable things while managing risk. That's possible.
That can affect future generations, and then the future generations get all pissed off because why did these
Yeah,
old people do this to us?
and what he's describing is basically what economists call a negative externality, when a cost or a risk is outsourced to another party and is not felt by you. And so, usually you need public institutions to rein in negative externalities, because otherwise you get a very unstable system over time.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, that's if they
I think
can
that's
kick
what
it,
he advocates for is some of that regulation.
yeah. And so, and again, that's what voters have to think about is when they vote, it's how are they managing the risks of what they allow and don't allow. Like if they want energy to be cheap, but they also don't want the planet to be destroyed, how are they managing the risk of pollution, for example? And not all the risks of pollution are climate change, like the Earth heating up and icebergs melting, right? There are other problems with pollution from burning fossil fuels. I mean, it's smoke, right? So yeah, let's go ahead and move on to the next one.
Now I want to get a little philosophical. One of my
good.
great heroes, Peter Bernstein, probably the best thinker in a philosophic sense and a real investment sage who sadly
like
passed
Gollum.
away around 2009, once said,
He had better years.
essentially, risk says we don't know what's going to happen. We walk
The unknown.
every moment into the
Yes.
unknown.
Gen X.
He said there's a range of outcomes, and we don't know where the actual outcome is going to fall within the range. And often we don't know what the range is. So, in other words, we have ignorance
Very wise
to
philosophy.
varying degrees about what the future holds. And it is from this ignorance that risk ensues. If we knew what was going to happen, by definition, there would be no risk. In the memo that I mentioned before, Risk Revisited Again, there's a great quote that I got from a Peter Bernstein memo. And I thought it was so important that I took it over word for word in my memo. It's from G.K. Chesterton, who was an English writer.
Falk Brown.
And he said the following, and I'm going to give it to you word for word because it's so important.
Okay, don't make us wait. Come on.
The real trouble with this world of ours is not that it is an unreasonable world or even that it is a reasonable one. The commonest kind of trouble is that it is nearly reasonable, but not quite.
I don't even think
Life
it's
is not an illogicality, yet it is a trap for logicians. It looks just a little more mathematical and regular than it is. Its exactitude is obvious, but its inexactitude is hidden. Its wildness.
I love
lies
that.
in
That
wait.
could be a Gen X
In other
motto.
words,
Its wildness lies in wait.
We know what's likely to happen. We know the other things that probably could happen instead. We have little appreciation for the things that are highly unlikely to happen, but could. And these are what we call in modern day terms
You gain that through experience.
tail events.
Mhm.
My friend Rick Kane once said that 96% of financial history has occurred within 2 standard deviations, but everything interesting has happened outside of 2 standard deviations. That's the wild part.
I have an illustration. Every single time there's somebody in the back that I don't know or think might be a troll, I'm taking a chance. I put that overlay on, and I am taking a chance. I have a guess of what might happen, a range of possibilities I'm expecting could happen if I let this person on. But I don't, it's not guaranteed, and it could go in a different direction that I'm not wanting. So there's a risk every time I let some of these characters on the panel, and I have to calculate that and make those judgments and adjust.
Exactly. And like when I joined your panel the first time, right? You're like, "Are you legit?" You put on the overlay,
Yeah, I didn't know
and
who you were.
so
I didn't
yeah.
recognize you.
But like it was clear to me even then, like
That Renaissance garb.
why that was happening. Yes, indeed. And what you're doing is risk management. And like they said in the quote, right, 96% of financial history has happened within, I think it's 2 standard deviations of what's normal. But what the 4% that's really interesting has happened outside of those.
That's
2
the
standard deviations.
outlying stuff.
Right? Because
Wild.
what do you think is the most? If you were to name a year from history, what do you think is one that is the most interesting? Like just
Like my personal history or just human history?
human history within finance. Obviously, you're only
Oh,
going back
within
probably.
Finance?
Yeah, obviously you're only going back a few hundred years tops. But
Within finance, I don't know a single. This is the most financial person I've seen yet. So I'll say
let,
this.
let
dude.
me let me put it a different way. What is a
Peter
specific
Bernstein.
moment, even if you don't know the exact year? What is a specific moment in the history of finance that is probably the most interesting to anyone who has anything to do with finance?
Well, I remember the Bernie Madoff scandal and Exxon,
Okay.
and then there's that collapse, that 28 recession collapse. COVID might
Okay.
be interesting too in terms of finance.
Okay. So the second one you said, right? It was 1929, the stock market crash of 1929.
Oh, I meant
Most people-
2008, but
2008 is probably the second one. So those are probably the 2 days that people think about the most when they think about investing in the stock market, right? And if people, like I've talked about how people can be uncomfortable discussing these topics, right? A lot of this discomfort is the fact that the most interesting parts, these unusual events, which are outside the 2 standard deviations, these are not the things you will normally experience throughout time as an investor. They're just so huge and interesting that they are what's burned into people's minds, and they think this is all that investing in stocks is. It's just the complete implosion, right? Right. So those sticks in our minds, but
I never thought that.
there are a lot of things that go normally, and it's people who understand, like, let the good times roll when the normal times are happening, but you manage your risk so that when the bad times happen, you're not ruined. Because Buffett was invested; he was fully invested.
So
in the
you
market.
roll with the good
Yeah.
times. That's
Yeah.
that 10% you keep with the market. Laissez les bon temps rouler. Let the good times roll.
Yeah.
And then it's really the bad when things get rough, or that's when you want to start managing your losses
Exactly.
so it doesn't go. Okay.
Yeah, so Buffett was invested. He was fully invested. He probably had a somewhat larger cash position than he normally does, but in 2008, he had most of his money invested in something, and yet he did not go belly up. He's richer now than he was then, right? So he did something to manage his risk, so that not only did he stick around, but he was able to gobble some things up.
And he
that
probably
needed
didn't
returning.
risk everything. He risked within a certain
Exactly.
window of tolerance that he was willing to play around with, that he could sustain the losses from.
Yeah, some of his stocks were down for a while, and so he had to wait for them to recover. But he also was able to move on some opportunities and pick up some great investments. So he acquired, I forget the name of it, the big railroad they had. They wanted to have one of the largest railroads in the country.
Pacific.
Yeah, that might be it. Yeah.
Or so,
About all of it
so
in the-
Sprint. It became Sprint.
Could be. And then,
Southern
and then
Pacific
shortly
Railroad.
after, in 2011, he made a big investment in Bank of America, and that was something he actually did directly with the CEO. He now has the common shares of Bank of America, but he made a specific deal. It started with a specific deal he made with the CEO that he was able to convert into common shares at a really big return. And the reason he could do that is because by 2011, there were still some issues. And Bank of America really wanted to have extra cash to keep itself stable. And Buffett was one of the few people left at that point who had a bunch of cash. So you got to make a good deal. So I think the point's made. Let's go ahead and move on to the next one.
Sure.
Hi, I'm Howard Marks, and this is how to think. More things can happen than will happen. For most events that lie in the future, there are a number of things that could occur. We don't know which one it will be. That's where the risk comes in. More things can happen than will happen.
Like in a
Number
board
two, as a result of that, the future should be viewed not as a fixed outcome that's destined to happen and capable of being predicted, but as a range of possibilities, and hopefully, because you have some insight into their respective likelihoods, as a probability distribution. The most likely, the less likely, the unlikely, but not
Right.
impossible.
Same with the
Number three,
conspiratorians and the
it's important
intuitorians.
to accept that even when you know the probabilities, that doesn't mean you know what's going to happen. This is
This is all
something that
basic
I
stuff.
think many people fail to grasp. I play a lot of backgammon, and a lot of my
Maybe not.
examples on risk and uncertainty come from the game of backgammon, which is played with a pair of dice. And when you roll your pair of dice, we know exactly in advance what the probabilities are. Each die has 6 sides. There are 36 possible combinations of the 6 sides. We know how many of them, for example, will add up to 7. And 7 is the most likely single outcome. 1, 6, 2, 5, 3, 4, 4, 3, 5, 2, 6, 1. There are 6 possibilities out of the 36
The middle of the curve.
that will give you a 7. That's the most likely outcome. 6 out of 36, that's 16.7% probability. Now, what if instead you want to know about a 6? Well, with the 6, there are 5 possibilities. 5 possibilities out of 36, that's a little less than a 7th. And then when you get down to the number 2, there's only 1 out of 36. And for the number 12, only 1, 6, 6, 1 out of 36. Both of those are about a 3% probability of happening. So we know exactly what the probability distribution looks like.
For 3 as well.
We know what's the most likely, the other likely possibilities, and the unlikely possibilities. We still don't know what's going to happen. So knowing the probabilities does not eliminate the uncertainty.
Right.
I worked with a professor at Wharton named Chris Getze, and the way he put it to me one time, we live in the sample, not the universe. In other words, the universe statistics, like I just explained for the dice,
Are much
determine
larger than
the things that could happen and maybe their
right.
possibility.
More things
But
in heaven and earth.
We live in the sample. We only
can
have
be
one,
dreamt of in your
outcome.
statistics.
and therein lies the uncertainty. A great way to think about this is on Super Bowl morning in 2016, they had a former
lost me.
football player on, and he said what I thought was one of the smartest things about probability I had ever heard. This game was Denver versus Carolina, and Carolina was heavily favored, and they asked him who he thought would win.
Panthers versus the horse.
And he said the following: Carolina wins 8 times out of 10. This could be one of the 2.
Yeah.
Now, this gives you the essence of probability and the essence of risk. Most people, if they hear that something's 80% likely to happen, they say, well, then I guess we know what's going to happen. I guess they might as well not play the game. No, 80% likely means that the other team
I mean, people
should
do this
win
with the
1
weather,
game out
don't
of
they?
5. So
Yeah.
have to play the game because we have to figure out which game this will be. And that leads to number 4. I take Dimson's statement that risk means more things can happen than will happen, and I turn it over. Even though many things can happen, only one will. Thus, the expected value, the probability weighted average of the possible outcomes, which is the basis on which people make many decisions, it can be irrelevant. They take each outcome, they multiply it by the probability, they add them up, and they get the expected outcome. And many people will say, well, we're going to take the course of action that has the highest expected value. But sometimes the expected value isn't even among the possibilities. Now, this sounds highly counterintuitive, but think about this. Let's consider a course of action which has 4 possible outcomes: 2, 4, 6, and 8. And let's say that we conclude that each of those 4 is equally likely to happen. So what we do is we take each one, 2, 4, 6, 8, we multiply it by 25%, the possibility of it happening, and we add it together. And in this case, the expected value of 2, 4, 6, 8 is 5. But 5 can't happen. Remember, I said the outcomes can be 2, 4, 6, and 8. So I'm only going through this to show you the possible fallacy of expected value. There's another problem with expected value, because even though course of action A can have a higher expected value than course of action B, course of action A may include some possibilities that you just can't live with. Maybe course of action A includes some remote possibility that you lose all your money. And even though it's highly unlikely, you may say, I just don't want to contemplate that.
Right.
So you don't take A, you take B instead, which has a slightly lower
This all
expected
happens
value,
on Survivor, too.
but without the risk of ruin.
Exactly.
In fact,
Wait.
most of Survivor is probably risk management.
Yeah, I would think so. But like you're saying now, like obviously, when you hear people talk about risk and investment, they're usually not talking about this, right? When I think when Flow State, said what he, right? I mean, it's just a useful example, right? Because he basically came in and gave the establishment idea of like what risk should be, right? And so he's saying, oh, only loan officers and underwriters really have to worry about this. But
Well, he didn't necessarily say what it would be or disagree with
it's
what it would
true.
be.
It's
He
true.
just had opinions on who should be focused on it.
Which I think is interesting from a loan officer's point of view, because I would want the people to whom I'm giving loans to be active risk managers. I wouldn't want them to never think about risk because my risk is inherently, if I'm lending them something, my risk is inherently tied to their own risk and what they do to manage it. Like a world in which everyone is a proactive risk manager of whatever it is they do is a world where it would be difficult for something like the subprime mortgage crisis to happen in the first place, right? And who gave out those mortgages? Mortgage officers, loan officers, different.
Maybe
positions.
that's why he's not a loan officer anymore. Maybe he wasn't very good at it.
Well, I'm not going to say he wasn't good at it. Maybe he was good at it, made some money, has some passive income, and he likes streaming. So maybe he's sitting on the throne of his success. I'm going to assume that's more likely, because I think it would be difficult for an incompetent person to just stumble into success like he has as a streamer.
Well, you're assuming success, but I don't know much about the guy there. I
I'm
know he
giving him-
works.
I'm giving him the benefit of the doubt. I'll let him prove me wrong.
Who is this dude?
Hi, I'm Howard
don't know.
Marks, and this is how to think about risk. Now, moving on a little bit to talk about the character of risk, I think it's interesting to note that risk is counterintuitive. They did an experiment in the town of Drachten, Holland. They took away all the traffic lights, traffic signs, and road markings. What do you think happened to the level of accidents and fatalities? It
Probably
went down.
fine. Yeah.
How could it possibly have gone down when all the road aids were gone?
'Cause
And the
people have
answer
to be
is people
grown-ups.
said, oh, there are no more traffic signs, traffic lights, or road.
See what happens when people are more proactive over their own risk management, right?
Yeah.
It's basically what I said. Imagine if people had done this about the mortgages they took out in the lead up to 2008. It's crazy.
Road markings. I'd better drive more carefully. On the other hand, Jill Fredson is an expert on avalanches, and she said that better gear is created every year, which makes it easier and more feasible to climb, and yet the risk, the number of fatalities and accidents in climbing doesn't go down. How can that be? Obviously, counterintuitive. People see that better gear is being invented, and they say, well, since we have better gear, we can do riskier things. And the level of accidents and fatalities is maintained even in spite of the
Because
arrival of
it
better gear.
increases the amount of
So,
risk they're able to take.
If you think about those two
Exactly.
examples,
So if we look at the subprime mortgage crisis just as a specific of that, right? It used to be if you gave a loan, right? You had the individual loan, and whether you kept it or you sold it to someone else who's then going to collect the interest, you have all of that risk. But what they started doing in the 70s, and this is what went wrong by 2008, is they made the mortgage-backed securities, where they would take a pool of loans and they would share the principal and interest repayment into a common pass-through certificate, and then they would sell slices of that as individual securities. So it's like being in a fixed income fund where instead of bonds, it's the mortgages. And they would say, oh, it's a diversified pool of mortgages, so it's not risky. But what this then encouraged them to do was just to give out riskier loans because they're like, well, it's diversified. So the chances that some of it will be repaid is higher than, like a perfect zero. But that still caused a financial collapse, right? So
Did they know this at the time that the risk they were taking, were they just being careless?
they were being careless. So just like, do the manufacturers making the better rock climbing gear know? Like, are they thinking about, oh, our customers are just going to try crazier things and they're going to die just as much? No, they're not thinking that, right? So the idea of a mortgage-backed security when they came up with it was, oh, what's this new thing? It's improving. It's an improvement in the technology of finance. There's not a lot you can do to improve the technology of finance at this point, but it was a
Well, that's
breakthrough.
what all tech people think until somebody comes along and invents a technology that improves it.
Well, it's not a hard science, right? So it's not like the physics of climbing up, a wall of rock or ice, and then like what materials the gear is made of, and then like what the human body can withstand. There's a lot of room to improve on those things because that's hard science. Finance is more of an abstract thing, and so a lot of things that are done in finance today have been thought of for centuries, even millennia now. It's just
Oh, like math.
yeah, like the mathematical side, right? The mortgage-backed security was one of the true novelties in a long time in finance, and it's like upgrading from a rock to a hammer, right? Um, and so we got carried away with it, just like the rock climbers, and it created more risk inadvertently.
Realize that the risk of an activity doesn't just lie in the activity in itself, but importantly, in how the participants approach
There
it.
you go.
The degree of risk present in a market or in an investment doesn't come just from the market or the investment, but how people participate in that investment. And if they conclude that the market has become safer, they may say that that frees them to do riskier things. And that's why I believe that risk is low when investors behave prudently and high when they don't. Just as risk is counterintuitive, I believe that risk is perverse. As I said, the riskiest thing in the world is the belief that there's no risk. A high level of risk consciousness, on the other hand, tends to mitigate risk. So when people say, well, that's really risky, if they take a cautious approach, then it becomes safe. As an asset declines in price, most people say, oh, it's risky. Look how it's falling. But with the lower price, it actually becomes less risky. As an asset appreciates, most people say, that's a great asset. Look how well it's doing. But the rising price makes it riskier. So again, perverse. And this perversity is one of the main things that render most people incapable of understanding risk. I think it's important to grasp a concept.
Perversity
Risk is
a
hidden.
barrier.
And risk is deceptive. Loss is what happens when risk, the potential for loss, collides with negative events. Buffett says everything the greatest. And he said that it's only when the tide goes out that we find out who's been swimming naked. It's only in times of testing that investors and their strategies are examined for the risk they really held. An example of that I wrote in my book, The Most Important Thing. Those of us who live in California, as I did at the time, our houses might contain a construction flaw. But if all is well, that flaw sits there for year after year and doesn't produce any loss. It's only when the earthquakes occur that the house is tested and the flaws are disclosed and the risk, the potential for loss, turns into actual loss. So similarly, an investment can be risky, but if it only exists in salutary environments, it may look like a winner for a long time, and it may look safe for a long time. The fact that an investment is susceptible to a risk that occurs extremely rarely, what I call an improbable disaster, what Nassim Nicholas Taleb called the black swan in his excellent book, the infrequency of loss can make it appear that the investment is safer than it really is. And of course, that's an entirely risky conclusion. So the infrequency with which risk turns into loss can be deceptive and cause people to underrate the risk involved in an activity.
I'm thinking going back to Gen X, and we were like the generation of risk, and I'm thinking of like doing drugs with all my druggy friends and the risky things you're
Hi.
tempted to do under the influence,
Mhm.
and that your friends were doing even more than you. So even being around certain friends on drugs, you were drawn into situations of what kind of risk am I going to take around these people? What kind of risk are they going to take that's going to put me in jail? I had to manage my risk around. There was a lot of risk management in being part of the Gen X youth culture and doing drugs and hanging around people that could influence your activities on those drugs.
I can tell you, like when I worked at that traffic law firm, there was we mostly did typical traffic citations, but another common one that wasn't technically traffic would be marijuana possession. People would get a citation for that. And in many cases, they would get a possession charge, not for marijuana that they themselves were using or intended to use, but because a friend or a relative left it in their vehicle. And then when they got pulled over for speeding, then it was found. And they didn't even know it was in the vehicle. So, it's like, what's interesting here is there's the speeding is a risk in itself, right? But it unlocked this other risk that wasn't even occurring to them because they weren't paying attention to, in a different instance, the risk of letting this person who they probably know is using illegal drugs. Right? So these risks,
Is it
like,
possible
add
to get
together.
overly paranoid about risk?
It can be, right? Because again, there's the risk of not taking enough risk. And some people just sit on cash and they don't invest in other assets. And with cash, at best you're getting whatever the interest rate is in that account. It's probably not going to be keeping up with inflation over time. And if you want to be able to make the money work for you and have financial independence as your body gets older and weaker and slower, you need it to be faster than inflation without the risk of imploding, right? So you need to do something with it, and you have to be willing to like look at charts that go up and down and not go, oh god, I'm going to throw up, right? And because a lot of people do that, and but there is risk in doing nothing, right? Like when I was in Army ROTC, they would put us in these training scenarios, like these mock combat. They usually get the most experienced cadets who are our mentors to play the enemy because they knew exactly how to fuck with us. And they would put us in these things and have us react to things just to see that we can react and we can make a decision and commit to it and at least justify the decision. Because we think that there is a right answer to things. And the truth is in life that there is often no right answer. It's not like a test where it's A, B, C, or D. They've already decided which one's correct, and it's certain which of the four choices you can make, and then which one will be the correct one. Life does not work like that. I look at life as in terms of we cannot assume that there's a right answer. Maybe we will find out what the right answer was at some point, but realistically, we should assume that we will never find out what the right answer is. Instead, we have to think of the mistakes I'm about to make. Which is the best mistake to make? Which one can I handle the most? Which one can I accept the most? Which one won't tie me up in guilt? Which one won't ruin my life? Which one won't have all these consequences that are too great for me to handle? If you can do that, you will then often find your way to success. You will not find your way to success by trying to find a perfect idea of success, but rather, by trying to, seeking out minimal failure, right? If you minimize your capacity for failure, you could just say failure is almost a synonym for risk at this point, right? You're much more likely to be successful. But yeah, if you're paralyzed, that's a risk in itself. Doing nothing is a risk in itself. You just don't feel it as much because it happens over time, right? Inflation usually creeps up very slowly, right? We see you have seen the effects of inflation over your life, even in the years where it was not very high. Like we recently just had some high inflation that's just gotten back now to what is more of a normal level, right? But even if you have like 10 straight years where inflation is in the low single digits, if you look at the start of that period and the end, you will see just how much less $1 can do. And that is the risk, right? If you're saving your money and you're not spending it, if you're at least doing that much, you don't do anything with it, it will be less valuable to you. It'll be like your $1,000 turned into $900. And that could be a big deal, depending on what your needs are in the future. Especially because you will probably need more money in the future because your capacity to work and produce can decline with age. Especially if you're not moving up in your career. If your only out is to make the money work for you, if you've plateaued in your career, you need to be a saver, and your money needs to be doing the growth that your career isn't doing at that point anymore. And, right? Everything I'm talking about, right? It includes stuff that people do in their portfolio. It also talks about risk management in things that are day-to-day life decisions. So just
Um, how much more of these does he have?
uh,
I wonder if we can get a little intermission.
let's see. So this is the seventh one. There's an 8, 9, and a 10.
So
So
three more. Okay, I need to take a little break for a minute or so and come
Okay.
right back.
all right, I'll take a break and then meet back.
All right,
I'll go ahead
do
and
that.
I'll test out the overlay. So it's great. Chat. If you have any questions, go ahead and put them in there, and then I'll address them as we reconvene. But we'll take it about like 5 or 10 minutes for Jeff. And what's the overlay button? Okay, that's it.
Oh God, that's hilarious. I don't know if y'all can hear me. Is that from StreamYard or did he make it?
Oh, that's from StreamYard.
Oh, I didn't know they had that. I need to start using it.
Yeah. Oh, it's actually good that you call it intermission because I was sitting next to a window and the sun was slowly creeping over me and cooking me.
Oh.
Okay.
Oh, well, yeah, guess it is good.
Yes. All right. All right. Let's hop back into it then. Are you ready?
Hmm?
Okay. All right. And
I'm Howard Marks, and this is how to think about risk.
still hearing it okay?
One of the most important things for every investor to learn is that risk is not a function of quality. This too sounds counterintuitive. There's
No, all of
belief
this
that
makes
high
so
quality
much
assets are
basic
safe
sense to
and
me.
low quality assets are risky.
All right. So when you hear it, right, you're like, oh, okay. But it's also, you know how like sometimes listening to Jordan Peterson kind of makes sense of something that you really either already knew or should have already known, but
Most
you
of it is
can.
stuff I already knew. I can't make sense. I can't follow Jordan Peterson. He's too. Spurgy.
Okay. Well, you know how for some people he kind of clears their mind, right? Like they know these things, but they're just there's clouds in their thoughts, whatever they may be, personal biases and such. And he lays things out in a way that a lot more people can understand what he says, right? You might say he's just saying common sense, right?
He's very easy to understand. So yeah.
Yeah. But like sometimes what people don't need is new ideas, right? Sometimes people need to hear common sense, but they need it communicated effectively.
How does any one person know what somebody else needs until they start asking them or interacting with them?
They don't know. So it's just he puts it out right into the internet, and then the people who need it respond, I guess.
Oh, okay.
But like, yeah, it's the same thing with risk here, right? It's so many people do things with their finances who really should know what risk is, but it just goes over their head. It helps to have it explained. It's helped me even. All right.
I believe quite the opposite. A high quality asset can be priced so high, then it's risky. I came to work in this industry in September of 1969. The banks at that time, and I was hired by one of them, engaged in what was called Nifty 50 investing. They invested in what were considered to be the 50 best and fastest growing companies in America. Companies so good that nothing bad could ever happen, and there was no price too high for their stocks. And if you bought those great companies the day I got to work in September of 1969, and if you held their stocks tenaciously for the next 5 years, you lost more than 90% of your money because the prices paid were just too high and unsustainable. And roughly half of those companies did run into serious fundamental problems. Their quality alone, or their perceived quality, did not impart to them the safety that people thought it would. And in fact, because people thought they were so safe, they bid them up to prices, which in fact made them risky. On the other hand, a low quality asset can be cheap enough to be safe. Again, this seems counterintuitive and maybe even perverse. When I left the world of equities in 1978, I was asked by Citibank to start their activity in high yield bonds. And now I was investing in the lowest quality public companies in America and making money steadily and safely. The juxtaposition of these events taught me an important lesson that I want to share with you so that you don't have to learn it firsthand. My conclusion was it's not what you buy, it's what you pay. And investment success doesn't come from buying good things, but from buying things well. And if you don't know the difference, you have to study up.
Well, tell us.
There
That's what
are
you're here for.
no assets that are so good that they can't become overpriced and dangerous. There are very few assets that are so bad that they can't be cheap enough to be attractive as investments. So this is a simple concept, it sounds like to me, but I hope you'll spend a lot of time thinking about its consequences.
So that's more directly relevant to stocks, but if you wonder why there's a stock market bubble, right? Like why that's a word that exists, it's because eventually even the best companies become too highly priced that they are just not worth that much money. And when the market realizes that, it's usually a big sudden realization and you have a crash. They gradually build it up over years, like the dot-com bubble. And then, when the dot-com bubble burst, did it gradually go back down? Not really. For the most part, it was a very sharp decline in a short period of time.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Chrome.
Hi, I'm Howard Marks, and this is How to Think About Risk.
How to think. Don't tell me how to think. No, I'm just kidding.
I'll do what I want. You can't tell me how to think.
He does help
Kamala.
clarify my already intuitive thinking about this.
Now let's talk for a while about the relationship between risk and return. This is one of the most important of all the topics. When I got to University of Chicago, the Chicago School of Theory with regard to investment had just been developed mostly between 62 and 64, and I arrived in 67. And there was a graphic that we saw all the time. Ooh. It shows return on the vertical axis, risk on the horizontal axis, and an upward sloping line to the right. we call that a positive correlation. One goes up, the other goes up as well. Now, most people would look at that graphic and say, well, that means two things, that riskier assets have higher returns. And if you want to make more money, the way to do it is to take more risk. I think that's a terrible formulation. Very simply, if it were true that riskier assets produce higher returns, then they wouldn't be riskier, would they? So that can't be the right explanation. What the upward sloping line, the positive correlation, means is that investments that are perceived as being risky have to be perceived as offering higher returns to induce people to make those investments. That makes perfect sense. The only thing is they don't have to deliver. And it's
So
from
you
the
have
possibility
it's
that the
deception.
projected returns.
Well, it's not deception because some people really believe like certain things are considered risks that are not, and certain
But you
things
want them
aren't
to
risks that
believe
are.
that. Like you deliberately want them to believe something different than reality.
So it is true that if you're on the opposite side of a transaction, right? You want to be benefiting from it. You want to be getting more out of it than if you're just leaving things the way they are. If you're just sticking with what you've got, and then that would make the other side naturally wonder, well, what do they get out of it? If you don't want what you're trying to sell to me, right? Why do I want it? And there are some things you can do where it's mutually beneficial, right? Like if I have food and no water, and you have water and no food, obviously there's value created for both of us if we trade a bit of our water for a bit of our food, right? But when it's purely a financial transaction, it's you give us money and we'll give you this kind of return. The question is, how risky is that? And there are certain types of investments that are sold to people with the idea of, they're less risky, or they'll give higher returns, and so people accept certain things. So, bonds, for example, usually have interest rates that are somewhere in the single digits. The average return to the market over time is about 10%, at the very least, the upper single digits. Bonds usually pay interest in sort of the mid to lower single digits. And, bonds that are considered risky will have interest rates more like that of the average return of the market. And so these interest rates, this is the return, right? If you get a 10% return on an investment, that would be no different than if you got 10% interest on something in the same period of time, right? These things reflect what the expectations are about risk and return. And, someone whose job it is to sell you a bond has to make you believe something about that risk reward story, whether it's, a lower, higher risk, lower, higher return. They have to make you believe something about it to sell it, and it's in their interest to sell it because it's their job.
That's not lying.
Not if they believe it. Some people really do believe what they sell, but that doesn't mean it's accurate, right? You can have a very.
But is that the stat? We want delusional people try to sell their stuff.
I don't know if we can ever avoid that, right? It's a big world of finance, and there are a lot of salesmen up there selling different types of financial products.
Does it disincentivize honesty or transparency?
So the fact that you can make money doing something dishonest incentivizes dishonesty. I don't know if it disincentivizes honesty, but it does incentivize dishonesty. Okay. Some people, if they have integrity, can't do it. So if you want to know why I left Fidelity, it's not because I think Fidelity tries to deceive folks, but I just knew too much about investing and risk management for my own good. There's a very bare minimum they train you to know in order to be licensed at the job. And I don't think Fidelity is much different than other brokers and advisory firms out there. And in fact, they are probably among the most responsible in terms of not doing risky things. But what they do is not value investing. It's called modern portfolio theory. And that's based on a lot of statistics about correlations and some of the ideas of risk and reward that's mentioned here that Howard Marks is saying can't be true. They assume it is true in firms like Fidelity, and they make investment recommendations to their clients and customers accordingly. So I would be talking with our customers. In context, it would be a 401k participant, and they would ask me sometimes a very simple question, and my response to that question is supposed to sort of herd them through this questionnaire that will take inputs from them and spits out a modern portfolio algorithmic answer. And then I have to say, that's Fidelity's advice. When I just want to answer a straight question with a straight answer, right? I could have said, I'm going to do this anyway. I'm just going to bite my tongue and do it. I'd have a lot more money now if I had done that. I definitely had the numbers up to that point.
Can you tell the customer, like, that's a good question, let me run it to the AI and see what they say? We'll start
if
there.
I said it like that, they would. If I phrase it in a way that intentionally makes it seem like the advice is lazy, that would not have gone well, right? So
even though it's transparent.
So it's honest for them. Is it honest to be paid by Fidelity to work for them and represent them in the best light, and do these little dunking moves on them while on the phone? No. So the honest thing to do was just to leave the job, which I did. So there's two.
Yeah, this is why I don't last in the workforce because I would be fighting with my boss over that. Like
exactly.
The day I found out it was happening, I'd be like, "Why is this happening? Why can't we do it this way? Why can't we tell the customers this?" And then I would be out by the end of the week.
Yeah, and I'm the rare person that would care because I spent so much time learning about investing that I knew a bunch of extra stuff that is not necessary for the job, and yet is true. And I couldn't confide in a coworker. Can you believe this? They won't even know what I'm talking about because they haven't spent the time to brush up on it like I
can
have.
relate. It's
and so you just have to say, okay, well, I guess my life is going to be a little bit more difficult.
I don't think the workplace is made for some people.
Yeah, so some workplaces, again, doesn't have to be finance, right? And again, it's like, was Fidelity necessarily... Fidelity wants something that's scalable and that is very hard for the average person to mess up. And there is something to modern portfolio theory. If we can give them some credit, remember when Howard Marks says, risk isn't just about the asset itself, but how people interact with it, right? The price people pay for it. There are ways in which modern portfolio theory will respond, if it's executed a certain way, will respond to bad market days that can keep investors from selling in a panic, right? There are aspects of that. But even so, it's like we're heavily limited in our ability to answer even simple questions with a straight answer. And I feel like if I can't do that and I don't like that,
I would have left too.
Yeah. So anyway, let's proceed with this video.
Will not be delivered that the risk ensues. When you look at the old graph, the linearity of the relationship between risk and return implies a dependable relationship. And I've always felt that was misleading. I was never happy when I got out into the real world and had to live with the consequences. And so I developed my own version of that chart. I took some little bell-shaped probability distributions and I turned them on their side and I superimposed them on the same line. It's the same underlying line, just now with some embellishment. With the old graph, as you moved from left to right, the risk increased and the return increased. But with this new graph, as you move from left to right, the expected return increases just as it did in the old one. But at the same time, the range of possibilities becomes wider and the worst outcomes become worse. That's risk. This is the way to think about the risk-return relationship.
An investor could ever look at.
Hi, I'm Howard Marks, and this is how
People
to think about risk.
You have to do this as for each video. Oh, it's the same intro.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, he's not writing the same thing on the pad all these times.
Yeah. If we watch the main video...
So now let's talk a little more about how
just
risk
heard him
should
say
be
it the one
handled.
time.
Right.
What determines investment success? And the best way I have to communicate this to you, in my opinion, is like the act of pulling one lottery ticket, the outcome, from a bowl full of lottery tickets, the full range of possible outcomes. As Dimson said, we're going to have one outcome. There could be many outcomes. And the outcome that occurs never amounts, in my opinion, to anything but one ticket pulled from among the many. In my opinion, superior
Well, physics says
investors
same thing.
have a better sense for the tickets in the bowl, for what proportion of them are winners and what proportion of them are losers than do most other people. That's what makes them superior. And thus, they have a better grasp of whether it's worth participating in any given lottery and how heavily to bet. Now, how should each of us deal with risk? I think that risk is best assessed through subjective judgment. Since risk cannot be measured, gauging it has to be the province of subject matter experts. And I'm clearly jaundiced on the subject of quantification. I believe imprecise, qualitative,
Yes,
expert
I love
opinion
this guy.
about the probability of loss
This works in mental health too.
is far
and
more useful
neurodivergence.
than precise but largely irrelevant numbers concerning past and projected volatility. So, what is the essence of risk management? Peter Bernstein, again, my hero. He said, because of the existence of risk, things are going to be different from what we expect from time to time. How well are we prepared to deal when it's different? This is a great formulation. There's no challenge dealing with the events when they turn out as we expected. The question is, are we prepared for when they don't turn out as expected? According to Bernstein, risk just means things are uncertain. Good things can happen as well as bad things. But I think the definition of risk should emphasize the bad things. And thus, I would say risk is the possibility that from the range of uncertain outcomes, an unfavorable one will be the one that materializes. It can consist of suffering a permanent loss of capital when bad things happen. It can also consist of missing out on gains when good things happen. These things have to be balanced. Let's say you think.
So what he just said is often what most value investors they will cut to the chase on as the definition of risk. And I've said it before in some things. Risk is the permanent loss of capital, or it's an inadequate return over time, right? So permanent loss in most people's minds is like, there's a crash, some kind of implosion, something has happened to the asset, you're down 80%, 90%, maybe even 100%, right? That's permanent loss. When you lose it, you can't put it back in the market and reinvest it. It's just gone. Whatever's lost is no longer able to grow and multiply for you anymore. And then inadequate returns is more like on the inflation example. So if you can at least keep up with inflation, inflation will slowly crash your wealth over time. And this is why it's so, when he says risk is deceptive, is you don't feel like you're losing things over the course of time with inflation. It's usually low enough that you don't feel it eating away at your wealth, but it does that. And some people are so afraid of investing that they let inflation do this to their savings. And the difference over the course of many years, can be thousands or millions of dollars of financial status, we'll say. And that difference, of course, will affect your standard of living. So those are the two main things.
Think that if you buy something today, there's a 1/3 chance it'll be down in 6 or 12 months. What will you do about that risk? Many people will say, well, I just wouldn't buy it. But what do you do about the other 2/3, the chance that it'll be up in 6 to 12 months? How do you balance the two risks? And, in the real world, we can't make decisions in one dimension. We basically have to balance. I think that risk is something that should be dealt with constantly, continuously, not sporadically. That's why I bridle when I hear this formulation. Is this a risk-on market or a risk-off market? Remember, risk produces loss when bad things happen. And that's when we need risk control. But I believe we never know when bad things will happen, and thus when risk control will be needed. I think the right model for thinking about whether we need risk control isn't American football, it's soccer. In American football, the team with the ball has the offense on the field. they have 4 tries to go 10 yards. If they go 10 yards, they get 4 more tries to go 10 more yards. And if they can keep doing it, they eventually score. But if the team doesn't go 10 yards in 4 tries, the referee blows the whistle. The ball goes over to the other team, and they try to go 10 yards in 4 tries in the opposite direction. So we have 2 teams switching between offense and defense, changing personnel when there are stoppages. That has nothing to do with the real world. The right model, as I say, is what the rest of the world calls football. The same 11 people mostly play the whole game. Nobody tells you when to be on offense or defense, and there are very few stoppages in which to adjust tactics and personnel. That's the real world. In investing, one of the key decisions is when to be on offense, when to be on defense, how much to allocate to each of those. But nobody tells you when to do it, and nobody stops the game to give you time. I think the best model for investing and risk management is automobile insurance. We all drive, we all have cars, we all have insurance on our cars, but I don't think any of us get to the end of a year and say, I wish I hadn't had insurance because I didn't have an accident. We like having insurance for the safety it gives us, regardless of whether or not
Paid
we
all
had
that
an
insurance
accident
money,
in a
no
particular
accident.
year. I think about the intelligent bearing of risk for profit. Back in 1981, I was interviewed by one of the first cable networks, and the reporter
if it
said
was
to me,
CNN.
how can you invest in high yield bonds when you know some of them are going to go bankrupt? And for some reason, I was able to come up with the right answer on the spot. I said, the most conservative companies in America are the life insurance companies. How can they insure people's lives when they know they're all going to die? And I think it's an interesting question. But the life insurance company is, number one, taking a risk that it's aware of. They're not shocked when somebody dies. That's the way it goes. Number two, they take a risk they can analyze. And when I was a young man and got my first insurance policy, they sent a doctor to my house to see if I was healthy. Number three, they take a risk that can be diversified. So no life insurance companies insure just smokers or just people who live on the San Andreas Fault or just skydivers, just young people or just old people. They have a mix, a diversified portfolio, and they take a risk that they're well paid to bear. They figure out the probability of what they're going to have to pay you based on actuarial assumptions. They allow some windage for the uncertainty, and then they charge you a premium. We do the same. We take credit risk that we're aware of. We analyze it. We take a risk that we can diversify. We have large numbers of holdings in every portfolio which respond to different factors, and it's a risk we're well paid to bear. We get what's called a risk premium or a yield premium to take the risk of default. So the bottom line is that I believe risk is kept under control in superior portfolios. That's one of the things that superior investors do. Highly skilled investors assemble portfolios that will produce good returns if things go as expected and resist declines if they don't. This asymmetry is, in my opinion, the critical element, the cornerstone of superior investing. Assembling a portfolio that incorporates risk control along with the potential for gains is a great accomplishment, but it's often a hidden accomplishment because risk only turns into loss occasionally when the tide goes out. But the prudent investor, and hopefully his or her clients, knows that risk is being controlled even at times when it doesn't come to the surface. So I think that risk is something to be managed and controlled, but not avoided. Risk control is indispensable. Risk avoidance is not an appropriate goal in investing. Will Rogers said, you've got to go out on a limb sometimes because that's where the fruit is. I think, and my experience tells me from watching others, that risk avoidance equates to return avoidance. Intelligent bearing of risk should be able to enable us to make good returns with the risk under control.
There should be one more. Oh, it's taking its time.
Hi, I'm Howard Marks, and this is How to Think About Risk.
Still say, don't tell me how to think.
So, what's the bottom line of all that foregoing? You shouldn't expect to make money without bearing risk. You shouldn't expect to make money just for bearing risk. Risk is best handled on the basis of accurate, subjective judgments made by experienced, expert investors who emphasize risk consciousness. The great
This works for
challenge
people
in
too, by the way.
investing is to limit uncertainty and still maintain substantial potential for gains. And in conclusion, I'll just say that outstanding investors are outstanding for the simple reason that they have a superior sense for the probability distribution that governs future events, the tickets in the bowl, and for whether the
Ticket to
potential
ride.
return compensates for the risks that lurk in the distribution's unattractive left-hand tail. This is what enables them to achieve the asymmetry that characterizes superior investors,
Separates the
participating
winners from
strongly
the
in the
losers.
gains when there are gains and avoiding many of the losses when there are losses. I hope the foregoing discussion will help you be among them.
Okay. So that
was
is
good. There's not a single thing I disagreed with, and that's very rare for me, that I can't find something to nitpick or criticize. So he passed the Jeff test at least.
Well, there you go. Yeah, so I mean that's why I liked it, because I thought it was great. I think it's, he is somebody who's like, he's in the system. He's part of the establishment, but I think he's one of the rare people in
I
that
feel
position.
good having him in there. Like that makes me feel better about the system, knowing that somebody like there is part of it.
Yeah, I think the problem is that there's just not enough people like him. But like, what I like about him is he's like, let me create a window, that anybody can look through, and that they can see a clear picture of how this all really works. And now he does talk about experts, right? He doesn't really explain what experts are. Experts are contextual, right? So some people call this just having an edge. Peter Lynch usually uses the term edge. He uses a lot more everyman language in his discussions about investing. But even if you're not an investor, like by your educational background, we'll say, you can still make investment decisions, and you still have expertise in something that can probably lend it to that. So as a peer counselor, for example, you might be able to make expert risk analysis in some of the things that goes on in the panelverse, particularly the drama, the human interactions.
I do all the time.
Yeah.
I've been doing this my whole life. My whole life is making risk assessments about people and communicating them, and people not listening to me, and the outcome happening exactly as identified. But I do it with people instead of companies.
Right. And so, but you can still make material decisions based on that. And then even if it's not with companies, you can still have a risk reward asymmetry in your favor that over time builds up, right? If you have a risk reward asymmetry over time, that, whatever the benefit is, if it's money, it will grow and compound. Non-monetary benefits can grow and compound. But let's go ahead and look at the comments and see what people are saying there. But Jeff, were there any other questions or things you wanted to raise about
No,
this?
my only impression is how basic this is. I feel like I would have understood this in grade school. It's so basic. If somebody had presented this to me, like it's so fundamental. It's easy. I think.
Right, this is a professional fund manager, and this is as hard as he thinks about risk. Like, I think what we heard here, if we were to reverse engineer any of his decisions, right, they would be about as simple as the stuff you hear here. And,
I think relating it to the panelverse is good, because I think that's a way a lot of people can be able to approach it. Like your risk of what panels to go on, what trolls to take risk on, et cetera, et cetera. The panelverse is all about risk management.
Exactly. So let's see. What's WASF
Do men
saying?
take more risk?
They do. Testosterone is, I know, linked to higher risk-taking behavior, which includes violence. But it's more broadly.
Gen X. Gen
focus
X was
on.
the generation of risk. Might have something to teach about taking risk.
So let's see. This is interesting. The risk of the stock market is great economic growth, which destroys the environment fastest. I would argue that natural disasters destroy the environment fastest. You know, like an asteroid hitting the Earth. I don't think we've ever
He
been
wants
able to
everybody
beat
poor
that.
because he thinks capitalism has a long-term cost.
Okay, so
That it's immoral to continue to
so
accrue.
yeah, WASF is that your standing here? I know Jeff is more familiar with you. I don't know the context in which you
Yeah,
raised some of the
he's
points.
basically an eco-terrorist.
Okay, gotcha. Be eco-friendly poor. Also becomes very profitable. I noticed he's been saying stuff about fossil fuel companies a bit more. And Plasma Void was here. I don't know if he stuck around.
He might be
Um,
hiking.
could be. Yeah. And so, you know, if nothing
Well, what
else,
can
Jeff,
someone like him do if he's that concerned about the effects on the earth? Like, are there companies he could invest in that would be part of the
um,
solution?
the only
How could he manage his risk?
the only green company I know of that is profitable to any appreciable degree would be Tesla. And I don't think Tesla is a good investment right now because of the price. So go into that in some detail. But Tesla is so popular that it's been in a bubble for a few years now, and um, so I don't think there are very many obvious green investments um, that would give you a good reward. Now, if he wants to donate money to some sort of green charitable cause, he could do that. And then, of course, the risk is that the charity wastes a lot of it on administrative stuff, not the actual environmental work or improvements. So he'd still have to do some due diligence there. Um, yeah. So Plasma, did you have anything you wanted to ask about the video?
Well, I think this was good. We got a good almost 2 hours.
You did, yeah. And
And
so, if nothing else, Jeff, I hope that this video is actually something, if you ever need to, you can look back to and re-examine whether it's just the Howard Marks thing or our discussion, you know, in this stream, and it'll be something you can, you know, feel like something you thumb through as like a guide for risk management. And I hope other folks who are interested in learning more about this, as we talk about it more, as I start doing my own content more, can look to. It's a great model for thinking about risk.
well, I thank you for presenting it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's see. Plasma says, I'm with
Very
Jeff. It all
understand-
seems very understandable, followable, extremely
Yeah, I'm kind of with
fundamental.
Plasma on this. I think it was a good
Okay, great. Awesome.
a good refresher to get out there. A good.
All right, cool. Well, I will go
So-
ahead and end the stream then, folks. If you haven't subscribed already, that's funny.
Well, now go out and manage your risk and see
Yeah,
see
manage-
if it did or not.
But yeah, please subscribe if you haven't already, and then I'll let you know more about live stream topics and ideas I have going forward. But thanks for joining, everyone.
Yes, thank you everyone, and thank you, Joe. And I'm gonna go in the Discord and continue the film fest.
Awesome.